I'm joined today by Laci Green, who is a sex educator, YouTuber, author of Sex Plus, Learning, Loving, and Enjoying Your Body. So much to talk about, Laci. Maybe a good place to start is you were raised Mormon and no longer are. Talk about that a little bit, because we've talked to former Mormons who have had sort of different paths out of Mormonism. Like, what was your path like?
Well, when I was about 12 years old, I don't know how much you know about Mormonism, but pretty early on, they split you up by gender.
Yes.
And I would say that that was around the time that I started realizing that there were things about the church that made me feel uncomfortable.
Mm.
Mostly coming back to the gender stuff. I think that in the Mormon religion, there's a really strong adherence to gender roles. And that was really alienating to me as a kid because, I was kind of like a tomboy. I did not like all this like crafty, let's talk about babysitting and it was just like it just struck me as weird as a kid. And I think that's kind of what started my exit out once I realized that there was a lot of misogyny in how the church, how at least, the church that I was a part of conducted itself.
Yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong, but like one of the main pillars of Mormonism is that, and again, you'll correct me, I'm sure. I believe that there are, is it 12 apostles who can only ever be men, right?
Yeah, and the leaders can only be men. And when you're a kid, you go through puberty as a girl, they tell you that your spiritual role on earth is to have babies. Like that is what you do. That's the most divine capacity that you have. And I just think that's really sexist. Like I'll just be really frank about it. Telling young girls that their greatest spiritual value lies in their ability to have babies is a really messed up thing to tell girls. Of course, it's great if you want to have babies and it's beautiful and it is powerful, but that's not all that girls are. That's where it started to trip me up a little bit.
So did you first express these hesitations to your family? Were they taken aback by your eventual leaving?
Yes. I fought with my parents constantly as a teenager, probably starting around 13 or 14, um, and told them how I felt about it and told them that I think it's sexist and told them that I think, a lot of this stuff it doesn't make any sense. There was a lot of weird stuff about sex, like masturbation is strictly off limits. And I would have to go to the temple in the church. You have to go talk to one of your church leaders, a guy, privately. And he like asked me all of these questions about if I masturbate and like how I touch myself and
There
like
you
all
go.
this weird, yeah, weird shit. And it's like that shouldn't be this shouldn't be like a regular process in the church. Why is it seen as normal for young teenagers to go talk about their sexuality with these weird old dudes? I don't know. It rubs me the wrong way. And I told my parents, and they got very defensive about it. But we're on better terms now.
Yeah, well, I was
I
going
was
to ask
also
about
just
that.
like a
Like,
little brat.
leaving Scientology has a very specific meaning, whereas like unless you're in the most Orthodox Hasidic Jewish communities, leaving Judaism is almost like a non. It just doesn't mean any. There's no reason to
Yeah,
think whatsoever that it'll have any impact on your relationship with your family. Where
yeah.
does leaving Mormonism sort of rank on that spectrum? Can you still maintain the same relationships or almost the same with your family?
I think it depends on the family. With mine, absolutely. I'm very close to my family. We have very, very close relationships and they're healthy relationships for the most part. So I think, it's possible if my parents were not that cool that we would be estranged
Hmm.
because of that. I do know Mormon kids, ex-Mormons, who have been estranged. But there's no like official guidance where you need to disown, not that I know of anyway, where you need to disown someone for leaving the church.
So what I find super interesting about you is that, as you just described, your initial sort of hesitations, concerns about Mormonism were heavily related to gender and what you perceive to be, and I would agree with you, are sexist and misogynistic sort of policies or ideas. And
Mhm.
in your earlier work on YouTube and on other platforms, you had a very sort of particular feminist perspective And over time, I think it might be fair to say that you have had a sort of political awakening, or maybe we would call it a realignment of sorts. Is that fair to say?
Um, I can see why it looks that way in the public, but I
Yeah.
would say that I feel all the same things I've always felt. I just say more.
Interesting. So what
Yeah.
give me an example of that, because so for people who maybe aren't familiar with you,
Yeah.
as much of my research shows, which you're free of course to dispute, you have maybe moved a little more away from the feminist side and maybe are finding more value in some of the anti-SJW, anti-feminist milieu of the internet. Is that fair?
I don't think that's accurate.
Good. Well,
I
I'm glad we can talk about it then.
I do not agree in any capacity with anti-feminists on
Okay.
feminism, and I don't agree in any capacity on anything substantive with the anti-SJW crowd.
Okay, good.
That said,
That said, here's where I think we're getting to the key part.
that said, yes, I think that there are plenty of smart people in that crowd. I think that their arguments are worth addressing and have more nuance than sometimes people give them credit for.
Good.
And where I do agree with them, this is probably the only thing we agree on, and why I've become really good friends with a lot of people that move in that sphere, is that I also agree that the way that social justice stuff is carried out sometimes is really toxic and bad.
Oh yeah. Okay.
And
So you and I are completely on the same page as far as that goes then.
okay, cool. Yeah, I mean, when I like really sit down and like talk to people about this stuff, people who have been angry about things they've seen about me online or whatever, usually we agree. It's like I didn't change my mind. I'm not like less of a feminist. I don't think anti-feminists have like good points or something. I haven't changed my mind. I feel just as strongly as I always have. However, I think that there are some crazy people on the left. Like there are some very wow. There's some really wild stuff out there
And when you
that
say that,
I
Laci, are there particular, is it just the people and the way they couch their arguments, or are there actually specific claims or arguments being made on the left that you hear and you say, I just simply don't agree with that?
I'm sure there are arguments being made that I don't agree with. So I guess one of the main ones is like some of the criticisms that are made about the way that identity politics are used,
Hmm.
the way that they're employed. I think there are pros and cons to identity politics. Obviously, the entire feminist movement is about women's identity,
Sure.
female identity. So I don't think that identity politics are bad wholesale. But I do think some of this like more inflammatory, clickbaity, weird stuff that people do with identity politics is really causing a lot of harm and alienation of people who could be allies to these causes, who otherwise agree but are being told, oh, you're like you're a white male, straight white men, you're trash, you're garbage, things like that. It's just like, why do you have to do that? I don't understand
Now,
why
how
that
prevalent
helps
is that?
advance
Like,
the
I basically I'm on board with what you're saying, with the
yeah.
exception that I can probably count on only one hand, and I'd probably have fingers left over for messaging that is straight up like straight white men are garbage. Like, I'm just not seeing that,
Yeah.
and my feeling from the research I've done is that it's vastly overblown that that exists. How serious of an issue do you think that perspective is on the left?
Okay, I used to feel the same way that you did
Yeah.
until I really started wading in and talking to people about this kind of stuff in a more holistic capacity, I guess. And I do think it's a problem. I do see a lot of it online. I don't think that that is like the most pressing issue. I
Mm.
think it's silly that people are so defensive about what some random egghead on Twitter said. But I also think that the discourse, that kind of discourse has become more commonly accepted. It's become a way to signal your wokeness to other people and to show other people how progressive you are. The virtue signaling stuff that people talk about. I think that's a real thing. And I'm also annoyed by it. I think it's obnoxious and unnecessary. And for me, it makes it hard to connect with people on the ground when about, feminism, sexism, whatever, when their first exposure to this stuff is from some really inflammatory comments online. And
Yeah.
obviously I agree with you. It's not like widespread. It's not like a defining thing within progressive movements, but I think that it has become too acceptable. And I do think that that kind of stuff has become too common online, especially.
Because you identified that there are some people on the right that are very, very smart people, and I'd love to, not that I don't agree with that, but I'd love to get that list from you. Do you get a sense that the alt-right recognizes that often while critiquing identity politics, they are effectively an identity movement? Do you feel like they understand that, or do you think that
Oh
that's
no,
really missing from their understanding of what's going
I
on?
don't. I don't think they understand that they're doing the exact same thing that they are mad at other people for
Huh.
doing. That's the hilarity of the alt-right, the white identity stuff. It's like, you guys are identity politicians as well. Like you're out here, you're mad about feminism, you're mad about Black Lives Matter, and yet you're doing like this weird white lives whatever. It's all the same thing. Of course, the white lives stuff is different in a very critical sense because they're not marginalized. These are people who don't have real systemic barriers
Yeah,
facing
I
them.
spoke about that. I don't know if you've been following this him too hashtag thing. I
No.
spoke about it yesterday on the program. And, I find that what's missing from the conversation about if you can have a Me Too movement, then you can have a him too movement about men who are falsely accused of sexual assault. Or if there's an LGBT student union, then why is it not okay to have a straight student union? And I feel like what's missing from the discourse is the historical understanding of why these groups have sort of surfaced in the first place and whether they've surfaced out
Hmm.
of good faith or in bad faith. I don't know how to
Hmm.
have that conversation successfully with people on the right. Do you know how that you can broach that issue?
I have had that conversation, but I think that for some people, they don't care about the context
Mm.
because they don't really fully understand the context. I think that's really what it comes down to. Like a lot of people are removed from the history of these issues and why, as you said, why things are the way they are now and why the context is everything here. Um, I don't know how to impress upon people the importance of context. You either acknowledge that that is a really important part of the conversation, or you leave a huge aspect of the conversation out, which is how we got here in the first place. Um, I find that frustrating as well.
I wanted to touch base with you about the sort of relative importance of different issues today. And there's a big debate right now, not about the substance. There is a debate about the substance of many of these issues, like gender pronouns, for example, or the
Yeah.
Me Too versus the Him Too movement or whatever. But then there's also a conversation about what issues should actually be prioritized in 2018. So is there an issue right now that you think is getting way more attention than it actually deserves? But then also on the other hand, are there issues right now that should be getting much more discussion that aren't really being talked about?
That's a good question. I think there's probably too much focus on feminist media, on the media, like on representative media and stuff, which I do think is important. And I do think that it's important to do sort of uh, critical thinking about the media that we consume and the types of messages that are in it.
Yeah.
Okay, I do think that's important. But I think it is disproportionately paid attention to, and people fight about it way, like they invest a lot of time and energy into fighting about that particular issue.
And to make sure I understand what issue, do you mean whether particular identities are represented in the news?
That, but also, is this new Netflix show properly
Oh,
feminist?
gotcha.
Or, was this comment that such and such celebrity made problematic? Just like things that you have to ask yourself, okay, what are we going to get out of this on a societal scale by investing a huge amount of time and resources into this one issue,
Mm.
right? And I don't think that it's proportionate. I don't think that's the most pressing issue of our time. I do think it's important. Like I said, I don't want people to of course, people are going to take me out of context either way, but
Yeah.
I do think it's really important. And I do think that there's tremendous value in those conversations. But I also think that there are very serious issues at stake right now in our country. And with regard to women, particularly, we are having reproductive rights completely rolled back. I mean, it is jarring to me what's going on and what's been going on for a long time. But now here we are with all this Kavanaugh stuff, and we're in a really, really vulnerable and precarious position right now with regard to reproductive rights, sex ed, birth control, just everything relating to sexual health and freedom. And I mean, there has been stuff online because of the Kavanaugh stuff, but before that, I just don't really feel like anyone really talks about abortion or talks about how these things are happening. It's almost like it's not a sexy enough issue.
I think that
You
what it
know?
comes down to is that when it's about legislation that's being debated, it has to reach a much higher threshold of salaciousness before it will enter the dialogue than, for example, someone like Jordan Peterson saying, I'm being forced to or will be punished for using this or that gender pronoun. And I think that
Right.
that's the issue in general that you're kind of describing, which is that the media coverage that develops around personalities on these issues seems to be much more powerful than the actual legislation around those issues, which could affect way more people directly.
Absolutely. You've said it perfectly well. That's exactly how I feel. And I think that something that frustrates me is that there's not enough recalibration. There is within professional activist circles, but just, the mainstream sort of feminist movement, people who are talking about this stuff online as a hobby or interest, I think they don't pay enough attention to the things that really matter, and the things that are really going to have the most direct effect on people's lives. Another example is the healthcare debate that's happening in the US. If people literally can't afford to survive, then what good is defending the perfectly constructed feminist narrative in a movie? Like I just priorities. That's how I feel about it.
We've been speaking with Laci Green, who is a sex educator, YouTuber, also author of Sex Plus, Learning, Loving, and Enjoying Your Body. Laci, really great to talk to you today.
You too, David. Thanks for having me.